to this enriching lecture of yours today. Our participants have been looking forward for a long time. Just to give you an idea, this particular GNOSIS lecture series started from May 17, and yours is the lecture number 30th. During this course of series, we have more than 2,500 registrations, and per lecture turnover is around 250 to 280 at least. As far as the feedback is concerned, we are receiving some very positive feedback about a GNOSIS lecture series. The credit goes to very stalwart speakers and humble personas like you all who have graced this occasion, and we are all excited, sir. So almost 170 people have already joined us, and we are expecting this number to at least go more than 300, 350 today. So it's an absolute honor, sir. On behalf of Team GNOSIS, let me formally introduce you to my audience. It's an absolute honor to have you today. Although Professor Tabish Khair needs no introduction, but let me just give you a background about this great author. Tabish Khair is born in a town in Gaya, Bihar, and is the author of various books, including the poetry collections, Where Parallel Lines Meets by Penguin in 2000, Man of Glass in 2010 by HarperCollins, Babu Fictions, Alienation in Indian English Novels by Oxford University Press in 2001, The Gothic, Postcolonialism and Otherness by Palgrave 2010, The New Xenophobia by Oxford in 2016, and the novels The Bus Stopped in 2004, Filming by Picador in 2007, The Thing About Thugs by HarperCollins in 2010, and 2012 reprint How to Fight Islamist Terror from the Missionary Position in 2014, Just Another Jihadi Jane in 2016-17, which was published as Jihadi Jane in India, and Night of Happiness by Picador in 2018, Other Roots, an anthology of pre-modern travel texts by Africans and Asians, co-edited and introduced by Khair with a foreword by Amitav Ghosh, was published by the Signal Books and Indiana University Press in 2005 and 6. He has also edited or co-edited other scholarly works. His honors and prizes include All India Poetry Prize awarded by Poetry Society and British Council, an honorary fellowship for creative writing, Baptist University of Hong Kong. Recently, we had Dr. Zhang from Baptist University, Hong Kong. He has been a writer in residence at York University, UK, and visiting fellow or guest professor at Cambridge University and Leeds University, UK, Delhi University, JNU, Jamia, IIT Bhubaneswar. His novels have been shortlisted for 16 prestigious prizes in 5 countries, including the Man Asian Literary Prize, the DSC Prize, and the Encore Award, and translated into several languages. 2 of his books, one fiction and the other non-fiction, have also been shortlisted for India's main book prize offered by National Academy of Arts, the Sahitya Academy Award. It's an absolute pleasure. The bio of this great persona will continue. It's an absolute pleasure on behalf of Team GNOSIS, Dr. Khair, to have you. I'm really happy for my participants who at this time of distress and negativity has got this, warm reception in the form of personas like you appearing. Just to give you an idea, information also, Geeta Hariharan and Dr. Kevin McGrath from Howard University have also graced our occasion, our GNOSIS lecture series. Dr. Zhang from Hong Kong University has also joined. Besides, there have been a plethora of scholars, researchers, and academicians from South Africa, Belgium, Nepal, who have joined this, who have presented their thought, their research work in this GNOSIS lecture series, sir. Without wasting much time, sir, I'm very happy that our associate editor is also with us. So without wasting much time, sir, the platform is all yours and the honor is all ours, sir.
Thank you, Shaukat. Thank you for this very kind and generous introduction. My thanks to all of you for being here. The morning has started with a bit of an alarm for me. I went to my office because the connection is much better in my office, and I had intended to do this from my office, but for some reason the university server is down today. This doesn't happen that often in my university, but it had to happen today. So I rushed back home, and right now I'm doing this from my home, from the sitting room. this also means that what I'm going to do is stitch together talk. That was what the plan was anyway. I dislike reading out a paper. And I feel when you do it digitally, it gets to be even more boring if you just read out something. It's boring anyway. I mean, all of you have attended the conferences and you know how boring it is when someone reads out a paper. So sometimes one has to do it, part of our job. But again, thank you for this. And I'll start off by talking about literature and crisis. And of course, we are all going through a period of crisis, and I hope all of you are taking care. I hope all of you are safe and continue to be safe. But this is a period of crisis. Exactly what its consequences will be is it's a bit too early to talk about that, even though of course people are talking about it, and I have talked about it too on a couple of occasions. And when we go through such a period of crisis, the question pops up, what's the use of literature? What can literature do in times like these? And various answers are given. Some people, for instance, you would have heard that there's a kind of surge of Corona literature. Almost everyone seems to be writing something or the other on what is happening. And that is, of course, one answer. People use literature to cope with various kinds of crises at the personal level. It's a valid enough option. Some people would also say that literature can be used to talk about the crisis at a more social, political level, and that's also a valid answer. So I'm not dismissing all these answers, but I'm going to propose something else. I'm going to propose an understanding of literature as literature, not literature as personal remedy, as documentation, as history, as protest, and so on and so forth. Those are all valid options, but they justify literature by highlighting one use of literature. What if we think of literature as literature? What use does literature have in or during a crisis? Now, my basic premise here, the hypothesis that I offer, is that literature is a thinking device. And this is something we tend to forget. We end up justifying literature in different ways with reference to communication, to nation, to politics, to the market. How much does it sell? Bestseller. Sometimes even I am introduced to audiences as a best-selling writer. I have no idea what that means, because if a best-selling writer is someone who makes lots of money, then I must assure you that I don't make lots of money. I need to teach in a university to earn my salary. But evidently that's a good thing to say. It's a kind thing to say, this is a best-selling writer. But obviously that's the market. That's not really literature. It's an aspect of literature. Even art, aesthetics, techniques of communication, they're all aspects of literature. Now, what is it that literature really does? And in order to understand that, before we come back to this question of what literature does during a crisis, we have to look at what literature is made of, so to say. And the one obvious answer is that it's made of language. Literature is in language. Actually, if you look at the word in the Western context, literature is by definition written language. Okay. Now that is problematic. All of us know that is problematic because many of us are post-colonial scholars or have been introduced to post-colonial criticism. We know how rich literatures of societies that did not have extensive writing or sometimes did not have any writing, these literatures were dismissed for centuries, well into the 20th century. And it's only in the last 40 or 50 years that we talk of oral literature. Now, of course, the idea of oral literature is also slightly misleading because once any text is written down, it is no longer oral. And at least one scholar of orality, Walter J. Ong, distinguishes between primary orality and secondary orality. He says that societies where writing is not a possibility were societies of primary orality. All other societies are societies of secondary orality, or, of course, written literature, hieroglyphic cultures. This has to be borne in mind, because today you can argue that there's almost no society, at least no extensive society, that exists in a state of primary orality. All societies have some modes of writing available to them. So what we can talk of today is only secondary orality. Now, I won't go into that very rich discussion, but I just want you to be aware of that. Now, to go back to orality, it's very interesting to see that if you really look at texts, and greatest texts in almost all cultures have their roots in orality, whether we are talking of Homer's Odyssey, or whether we are talking of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, we are talking of texts that have roots in orality. And one of the things you notice about all these texts in different cultures is that they exist in different versions. Some of the versions can be quite different. Most of the versions are just slightly different. And this, of course, shows you how orality worked. Orality worked on the basis of large groups of participants. A text, in order to be passed on, had to be learned by heart and passed on to the next generation and the next generation. Now, this seems to be very easy to us because we are thinking of secondary orality. We are thinking of a text that is already written down. And then we say, okay, have you learned the daffodils by Wordsworth? And we can have the text next to us and we can say, oh, no, you forgot this word. Wordsworth didn't say, when oft on my sofa I lie. He said, when oft on my couch I lie, okay? Because that written text is there. Now, in societies of primary orality, the written text is not there, which means that every interpretation needs a community of listeners who are also participants. And they are going to remember certain things in certain ways. One way to test this out is just to play this very ordinary party game where you whisper a sentence into the ears of ear of someone sitting next to you. A simple sentence like, my uncle came back from Calcutta yesterday. But only that person hears the sentence, and then he or she whispers it into the ears of the person next to him, and so on and so forth. And after 20 people, the sentence comes back to you, and it's totally different from what you have whispered. Now, this is one aspect of how it works, but this is only the audio aspect. What I'm talking about in oral cultures is a much more complex aspect. Now, what it means is this. Today, we talk of reader response and so on and so forth. We are talking of a written text. Okay? But in oral cultures, there's always reader response, but it is already part of the text in inverted commas, the text that is going to survive. The reader, who is not a reader, is a listener, this listener response. And the listener is going to remember that story, that song in certain ways. And this is both good and bad, because this also means that there's less of a chance of idiosyncratic minority protests in oral cultures. How can you actually protest if there's only two of you who disagree when the rest of the tribe, 50,000 people, agree? How are you going to survive? Make that song, that interpretation of that song survive? Okay. So keep all these things in mind, and then we move to literature. And now we move to what I'm going to talk about, written literature. Because the reason I'm leaving out oral literature is that it's a different world. It's a different planet. So I'm not leaving it out because it's not important. I'm leaving it out because it works in a slightly different way. And today we do not really have oral literature. We have secondary orality, which means that the written text comes into play. Okay. Now, what is the written text? The written text is obviously written in language, and it's written about the world. The world defined generally, the world in your head, the world outside your head. Politics, society, history, gender, sexuality, marketing, whatever. It's all there. Okay, that's what literature is going to be about. What else can literature be about? Okay, that's what literature tries to do. Talk about how you think and live in this world. So in other words, literature is about something that some philosophers would call reality. Now that brings up the first problem. Reality, what is reality? No, most of us, I guess all of us are from India, and we know we have a long tradition in India of philosophers critiquing reality. What is reality? What is real? So I don't even have to dwell on this argument. Reality, we perceive reality in different ways. We have different definitions of reality, but still, literature uses language to deal with what we call reality. Okay. Now, if we move further on and we look at the 20th century, one important element that has come through is our understanding of language. Now, for me, the most important philosopher, scholar in the 20th century who worked on this is Saussure. Okay. Saussure's definition of language as a system of differences, dividing it up not just between the sign and the referent, but the signifier and the signified. That understanding of language cannot be denied. What Saussure said, and in different ways our philosophers and other scholars had said something similar without specifying it in such a concrete manner. What Saussure said was that language does not really have any given natural relationship to the world out there, to reality out there. What I'm thinking on is called a chair. What I'm sitting on is called a chair, but there's no reason why it should be called a chair. We know that in Hindi and Urdu it will be called kursi. In other languages we call a lot of other things. The reason why chair means chair is because it exists within a system of differences in this particular language, English. A system of differences of similar signs. I'll stick to sign referent. I'll leave out signifier, signified. Similar signs like stool, sofa, and so on and so forth. And because of the system of differences, chair has a specific meaning in that language, which to some extent alludes to something out there. Okay? But it's not that thing out there, which is automatically, naturally a chair. If we took chair out, you would probably need some other signs in there, and it would also perhaps affect the meaning of other signs. For instance, if we didn't have a word like chair, we would need to find, we would affect the meaning of words like stool and sofa and so on and so forth, because that thing out there, chair, would probably have to be accommodated, and that would affect the system of differences through which we construct meaning in language. So that is basically what Saussure said at its simplest. I'm simplifying, of course, at its simplest. Now, what this means is that we use language and literature to talk about something that cannot be just simply represented, naturally represented, easily communicated. Communication is not transparent in language. Now, this applies to all kinds of language usages, not just literature, all kinds of language usages. Bear in mind that both representation and communication might not be just human properties. We know that animals communicate. Okay? We know that even plants communicate. We know that there are plants that give out signals, sometimes using microbes and maybe even viruses, by the way, because we are in this period, that give out signals that warn other plants of a predator. So if for instance, a goat starts eating this plant, the plant which is being eaten sets off chemical signals which are communicated, sometimes through roots, sometimes through the air, to other plants of a similar species. And these plants start manufacturing bad chemicals, which would prevent this animal, this herd of goats or deer or whatever, from eating them. Okay? We know that this is how it works. There's even evidence that some plants set out chemicals that attract predators, which could then come and kill this herbivore that is devouring them. Okay? So not just animals, plants communicate too. But human beings use language to communicate at a very abstract level, at a kind of level that makes the issue of reality, representation, communication, all of it very problematic. And that's basically what Saussure talks about. Now, if we look at this, then we have to ask ourselves, what are the ways in which language is mostly used in other fields? Think, for instance, medical research. Think, for instance, sociology. Think for instance, law. Okay, what is the stress that these fields put on language? And at the risk of simplifying matters just a bit, I would say that the stress is on transparency, on communication. These are fields, including actually literary criticism at times when we talk of literature, something I do too as a professor. These are fields that insist on transparency, on communication. They leave out everything that cannot be communicated, that cannot be transparently represented to other people. Okay. The attempt is to be as clear as possible so that what I say means exactly the same to you. Now, all these fields know that it won't be 100% transference, but the attempt is to actually focus on that aspect of language as a communicative device that talks about reality in a way that can be largely accessed by everyone else. This, of course, sometimes ends up leading from terminology to jargon, and then we complain about it, but terminology is obviously an aspect of it because terms are fixed. Of course, again, they change over time. That's the nature of language. Language changes. Language is always in flux. Language is always difficult to pin down. But still, other fields tend to do that. By and large, I think literature as literature is the one field that works with the awareness that language is slippery, that language cannot be pinned down, that language is always changing, and that we still have only language to talk about reality as human beings. Okay. This is still our best device to think. But how do we think about the world out there, which is not connected naturally to language, using language, which is itself slippery, which is a system of differences, of shifting meanings across a space, across time, across people? How do we do all that? And I think literature at its best has learned to do this. It's difficult to quantify, but you can see that it happens. And there, when I say literature, I also mean many texts that some people would perhaps place within philosophy or religion. For instance, the Ramayana is literature. Okay? The Quran is literature. The Bible is literature. Okay? Because in some ways, all of them work with this understanding. I'll give you just one example, leaving out Hindu and Muslim texts, because I'm afraid that these days religious Hindus and religious Muslims tend to shout a bit too loudly, and I'm not someone who likes shouting. So I'll stick to a safe text, Book of Job from the Bible. Okay. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Book of Job. It does something that a lot of religious texts do. Okay, Job is this good human being. I'll call him a good Christian, but of course not a good Christian because this is a pre-Christian text. But just for the sake of convenience, I'll call him a good Christian. Okay, he's a good Christian. God loves him. He does everything. He offers all the right sacrifices. He keeps all the right feasts, and so on and so forth. He has so many sons and so many daughters and so many flocks of cattle. But the devil, Satan, argues with God and says, look, you always boast about Job. But Job is so good because you've given him everything. Hurt him a bit. Do something to him. Then let's see how God-abiding Job might be. And this happens. God says, fine, Satan, you do what you want to do. And Satan starts afflicting Job. his cattle die, his land is devastated, his children die, but Job still praises God and retains his trust in God. He's afflicted with diseases himself. His friends come to him and they come up with different explanations. One of them says, God is like that, there's no justice. One of them says, oh, you must have done something bad. That's why you're suffering. You have hidden something from us. And they come up with all these explanations. But Job's position is very clear. He says, I have done nothing to deserve this suffering, and I believe that God is just. Now, bear in mind that this is a total contradiction. Someone who says, I have done nothing to deserve this suffering. This suffering is undeserved, but I believe that I live in a system that is essentially just. How is he going to deal with that contradiction? And that is what that story is about. At the end of it, of course, everything is restored to Job, and God even comes with an explanation. But if you read that story as a work of literature, what you are left with is this question, not the answer. There is no answer in that story. The answer is given to us by Christian fundamentalists who say, the book of Job shows that you just have to keep your faith in God and everything becomes, well, good. But of course, in real life, if your children are killed, they're not brought back to life. In real life, if you get very, very ill, you're not restored to health, okay? So we know that this is not the world as it exists. Job's relief from God is not believable, but his questions are pertinent. His questions make us think, how does one live in a world where suffering can afflict people who do not deserve it? A world where there's undeserved suffering. Now, this is an ontological question, and you can see that lots of other literary texts have also engaged with it. For instance, you think of Shakespeare's King Lear. King Lear comes to mind because some people argue that King Lear was written when Shakespeare was in quarantine during one of the plague bouts in London. So, of course, this is not, you cannot prove it, but that's one of the arguments. And if you think of King Lear, which you would all be familiar with, King Lear can be read in different ways, but toward the end of King Lear, something very tragic happens. First of all, Shakespeare, who was very good at stealing his stories from other sources, had stolen this story from other sources, but he had made some changes in the story. One of the changes is this one. In the original source, Cordelia does not die. Okay? King Lear does not die. In his play, Shakespeare puts Cordelia and King Lear through a lot of suffering, and King Lear's question is exactly the same as Job's. Why? Are the heavens just? Bear in mind that Lear is also being very careful. He has found a pre-Christian play. He doesn't want to question God in the Elizabethan period and have his head chopped off. So he has found a pre-Christian play, but he's talking about exactly these matches. And then toward the end, everything seems to be going well, no? Finally, Cordelia loses battle, but she's put in prison, and King Lear says, fine, I don't care. I just want to spend my time with you. Let other people who want power run the country. But then Shakespeare does something else. He kills Cordelia. Okay. Just when you would start believing that maybe the heavens are just, Cordelia, the most innocent person in this play, is murdered. And then towards the end, King Lear dies too. Okay. In other words, you're left with the same question. Is there divine justice? Do we live in a world where only the evil suffer? How do we understand the suffering of those who are not evil, who are not that evil, who might even be good? Okay. This is the literature dealing with the stories that are actually difficult to talk about. If Shakespeare had discussed this in Christian terms, he would have been in serious trouble. Maybe he couldn't even think about some of these issues in Christian terms, but in some other terms, pagan terms, he does think about these stories. Okay, and that is one of the reasons why King Lear keeps on appealing to us. The various ways in which the play is read change, but some of these questions remain pertinent. Our approaches to the question change too. King Lear was read differently in the 18th century, differently in the 19th century, and it's being read differently today. Okay? The play is not universal in the sense that there's only one reading of it. That's a religious fundamentalist reading. Okay? One reading. Okay? That's not why King Lear is universal. King Lear is universal because the depth of meaning in that play reveal significance despite the way in which we think. Our thinking changes, our relationship to language and reality changes, but the play still contains enough depth to help us think. It's the thinking device in that sense. Okay. Now let us take up something more specific and less ontological. Let's take up a historical matter. Because, of course, some matters cannot be settled. The idea of whether there's divine justice cannot be settled. It can only be discussed. But certain other matters might be settled with time. But in a particular period, in a particular society, from a particular perspective, they might have appeared much more ambivalent and ambiguous once upon a time. I'll illustrate this with reference to another text, a text that I again hope all of you are familiar with, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Now, you would be aware that Joseph Conrad was Polish. English was not his first language. It was probably not even his second language. It was a language he picked up quite late in his life, but he wrote in English. The fact that he still, to some extent, perhaps thought in French can be revealed if you look at his sentences, which sometimes have a French structure. So, he is also one of the most, let's say, influential fiction writers from the late 19th century, the period of British colonization at its pinnacle. In Heart of Darkness, he presents a very complex frame narrative, which sends the main narrator, someone called Marlowe, up the Congo to rescue someone called Kurz. Okay. Now, throughout this novella, starting with the title, Heart of Darkness, there's a suggestion that Africa is a place of darkness. There are also other very disturbing aspects in this novel. For instance, Africans are almost always referred to as cannibals, and even in at least one part, they are made to refer to themselves as cannibals. Okay? Obviously, these are things that provoked the great 20th century Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe when he wrote his essay critiquing Heart of Darkness, published in Massachusetts Review, but now widely anthologized. And Achebe did not just critique Heart of Darkness as a racist text. He said that Conrad was a racist. Okay? Very harsh commentary on someone who was considered to be more or less what we would today call left-leaning in the period when he was alive. Now, of course, at one level, you can say that everyone living in the 19th century was a racist, okay? So I'm not talking of that, and Achebe wasn't talking of that either. Everyone was a racist because in the 19th century, almost everyone believed that race was a correct biological category, which could be used to distinguish between people socially, ethically, morally, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, everyone was, to some extent, a racist. Okay? Achebe doesn't have that in mind. He has in mind racist, as we understand it today, someone who denigrates other races, in this case, Black Africans. Now, there's no doubt that there are these problems in the novella. However, there are also lots of other things in the novella, some of which I'll just put before you. For instance, the novella starts at the mouth of the Thames. And Marlowe is sitting there with 3 other people, and then he starts talking about his story about the time when he was in Africa. Okay? But the first few pages are mouth of the Thames. And the first description is about darkness. But the darkness is all entirely over London. Okay? And again, when Conrad talks about darkness, he refers as often to Europe, to London, and actually much less often to Africa, okay, than one would imagine. But this is a minor point. You go on and you realize that Marlowe is sailing up the Congo. And Marlowe has a ship. There are few other Europeans with him, and all the other sailors are Black Africans. Marlowe thinks of them as cannibals, and one of them, who is his pilot, also describes himself as a cannibal. Okay. Now, there's a period when everyone on this ship, all of them, run out of water and food. And Marlowe says, "Oh, I don't understand. These Blacks were suffering much more than we were. And they outnumbered us. They could have easily overpowered us, but they never did it. I don't understand." Okay. Now, what is he trying to say there? I don't think Conrad is aware of it. I don't think Marlowe is aware of it. Okay. But what he's trying to suggest is, we call these people cannibal. I even got one of them to call himself a cannibal. But do we really understand what cannibalism means? And he says that in different ways in the novella. Now, this doesn't excuse Conrad. Okay? Conrad is still writing for white readership, and if he describes Africa as not cannibal, people would say, "Oh, this is not Africa, this is Europe." Okay? He's caught in the discourse of his time, which unfortunately constructs Africa as a space of superstition, of cannibalism, and so on and so forth. Not what Africa was. There were old cultures in Africa. There were ancient cities in Africa. Okay? But Europeans did not see them in the 19th century, and Conrad doesn't see them too. Okay? He is after all a European. Okay? But he still looks at language, and he finds these small gaps. And throughout the novella, these gaps get bigger and bigger. Some of them are literally blind spots, like the ship proceeds, and the few Europeans are sitting there on the deck, and they have nothing else to do, but they have guns, of course. So they're shooting animals. Then there are some natives on the riverside, and they seem to be hostile. But the ship is beyond the range of their spears and bows. But Marlowe says these Europeans on the deck, they want to shoot the natives. Marlowe doesn't want that to happen, so he blows the whistle of the ship. It emits an eerie sound. The natives start running away. And then Marlowe says, I'm quoting him more or less verbatim from the novella, "But those idiots on the deck wanted to have a bit of fun, and the rest was lost in a smoke." What is lost in a smoke? What is the rest? It's a massacre. It's a needless massacre of natives who are not even dangerous. Okay? And Marlowe cannot really say that Conrad cannot really say that, but the novella records it and moves on. Okay. Now, bear in mind, one of the reasons why Heart of Darkness is still pertinent, it still moves us, is exactly this capacity that Conrad has of using language to talk about something that cannot be discussed in that historical period. That it's not possible to use language to talk about it and still get across to the readership Conrad words. And still he talks about it. This goes on until the end of the novella, when actually Marlowe comes back to Brussels. Okay, bear in mind, I've left out the politics of the situation, but he comes back to Brussels. Okay. And you know that King Leopold of Belgium was basically the private owner of all of Congo, which is why all of this was happening. And now he comes back to Brussels and meets the woman who was supposed to marry Kurtz. Kurtz, of course, is dead now. Kurtz has died in the forest. He has died after actually running away from Marlowe, refusing to be rescued, so to say. Kurtz, of course, has done nothing there. He's supposed to be a genius, but he's done nothing there except give guns to a group of natives and get them to shoot other natives and collect ivory. Okay, so his place is basically a fortress full of bones and ivory. Okay. Now, this is again an interesting matter we'll come back to later. But we come to the ending of the novella. Kurtz is dead, and this woman who has always lived a privileged life in Brussels is talking to Marlowe. Forgive me, the woman talking. Forgive me, I have mourned so long in silence, in silence. You were with him to the last. I think of his loneliness, nobody near to understand him as I would have understood, perhaps no one to hear. To the very end, I said shakily, I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright. Repeat them, she said, in a heartbroken tone. I want something to live with. I was on the point of crying at her. Don't you hear them? The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly like the first whisper of a writhing wind. The horror, the horror. His last word to live with, she murmured. Don't you understand? I loved him. I pulled myself together and he spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was your name. Bear in mind, his last words are the horror, the horror. Marlowe hears them in Brussels. Okay. He doesn't hear them in Africa. He's told that that's what he said. In Brussels, he hears them in the wind. But Marlowe is a civilized person. Marlowe cannot speak the truth. Marlowe cannot bring back the truth from the colonies. What Conrad is telling us, whether he's aware of it or not, is that civilization based on that kind of exploitation is a lie. And we are all complicit in it because we are decent, we are good. We cannot speak the truth. Marlowe is in a catch-22 situation. If he had said, oh, he died saying the horror, we would say, oh, what a bastard. He cannot say that. On the other hand, when he says, oh, his last words were your name, he erases that history of oppression, murder, massacre that characterize Kurtz's use in the Congo. Okay? This is what literature does. Okay? This is why literature is a thinking device. Literature enables us to think in language, but it enables us to think about things which are unthinkable, which are difficult to think about in the period or perhaps forever, like, is there divine justice? That's something we can keep on thinking forever. But something like this. Conrad is obviously, Ashimi is right, Conrad was to some extent a racist. He was also an excellent writer. Okay? And he struggles with language. How do we use language? What do they mean? What do we say? What do we fail to say? How can we say what we cannot say? Can we ever say what we cannot say? And so on and so forth. Okay. Of course, this is not to say that Conrad was this person who could float above the prejudices of his time. No, he couldn't. For instance, if you think of Heart of Darkness, he portrays Heart of Darkness, the enterprise of Kurds, as basically collecting ivory. Okay? But we know that the Congo in that period was not being exploited for ivory. Ivory was very little of what was being extracted from the Congo. What was being extracted was something much more complex and something Conrad cannot mention. Not because he's been prevented from mentioning it. He could have mentioned it. Conrad is writing for Britain. He's criticizing a colony that belongs to Belgium, okay? Which is why he can be reasonably critical, okay? So he could give us the real reason, but he doesn't. And it's important to think of what the real reason was. The real reason was Dunlop. The real reason was rubber. Okay? Rubber was high tech in that period. Rubber was being used widely. Congo contained millions of rubber trees growing in the wild. King Leopold of Belgium had claimed all of it as his private territory. He had given monopoly to a corporation. He had given them the right to extract rubber. He had given them the right to do it without paying the natives. He had given them the right to punish them if they failed to extract rubber. So that these agents would come to a village. They would tell them, you have to collect this many baskets of rubber by such and such date. The natives would go out. They would collect maybe 2 baskets less. So in some cases, two natives would be caught and their hands chopped off. Next time, 2 natives might get their heads chopped off, okay? And so on and so forth. That is what was happening. And Conrad knew it because he had been to the Congo. He had spoken to Roger Casement, a brilliant Irish, in the beginning diplomat, but then he ended up doing other things, but a brilliant Irish, let's say, Irish person, a scholar, who wrote one of the first expos of what was happening in Congo. Later, he also wrote a brilliant expose of European colonization in South America. Finally, he ended up joining the Irish independence cause and was executed by the English. But Casement was there. In the period, he was very popular. Conrad met Casement. He also met Casement in London. And Conrad knew what the economic reason for this kind of exploitation was. But Conrad does not get Marlowe to mention rubber. He mentions ivory. Now you ask yourself the question, why? And the answer is simple. Because rubber is modernity. Ivory is the past. He cannot construct Africa using rubber. So Conrad is part of that discourse, okay? Unfortunately. And he's also not part of that discourse because he leaves holes, gaps, contradictions, paradoxes, which we can excavate today. And then we hear voices that maybe even Conrad could not hear. But because of the way he uses language, because he's aware of this difficult relationship between language and reality, he can leave us with a text that we can read differently. Okay, I think that was basically my talk. I think I have exceeded my 45 minutes by about 1 or 2 minutes, but yeah, that's what I had to say. If you have questions, please. I just have to say one thing. I suffer from hearing impairment. Actually, when I wear hearing aids that you cannot see. I'm very small now. So if you ask me a question, I might not be able to hear you because of the fact that anyway, sound can be quite difficult on Zoom and other kinds of digital communication. So what I suggest is that you either pass on the question to Dr. Banerjee, or you write it down in the chat box, which I'm switching on now. Yeah. Oh, I can see that you already have lots of questions in the chat box. Okay. Okay, Shaukat, you run the show now.
Thank you, sir, for speaking at length, non-stop for 45 minutes on various issues, starting from orality and finishing on Art of Darkness. I'm very honored to hear you today, and at the same time, you have given some very interesting inputs regarding the way Heart of Darkness can be read, interpreted as a post-colonial text. And the interesting part was the connotation that you gave on ivory and rubber, which surely will help me as a teacher to teach my next class on this particular text. Uh, Thank you very much for that, sir, personally, and also from the participants' point of view, because most of our participants are academicians and would-be academicians, PhD research scholars. So, sir, I know there is some there can be some hearing issues, as you said. Let us just try one with that. If it is okay, fine. Otherwise, I will moderate. I want to connect you directly to our honorable associate editor of GNOSIS, Dr. Indira Nityanandam. She has played a pivotal role right from the time this international journal was being started. That is in October 2014. So it's my honor that I could connect both of you. So let us try with this one, sir. If you are okay, then we move ahead. Dr. Indira, ma'am. Dr. Indira.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yeah, I found you. Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. It's been a wonderful 45 minutes, and I'm sure we could go on for another 45 minutes, sir. You've really given us an opportunity to look at two texts which all of us are very familiar with. My question takes us one step forward. If in this post-colonial era that we live in, you had to take a later text to apply the same principles, which one would it be? It's out of curiosity that I'm asking this question.
Well, I think you can take almost any good work of fiction, and it can be used. I mean, for instance, Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie. Even though I'm not a great fan of magic realism, those of you who have read me would know that I usually avoid it. But yeah, or Indra Sena's Animals People. Geeta Hariharan's early novels do that too. So I'm just sticking to South Asia. Mohsin, the Pakistani writer, fundamentalist, the reluctant fundamentalist, Mohsin Hamid. He does that very obviously in The Reluctant Fundamentalist. and I must say that I try to do it in my novels too. So quite a few.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shaukat.
Thank you, sir. Next would be the question from one of our, integral part of GNOSIS team, Dr. Nandini Sen from Bharati College, Delhi University. Dr. Nandini, ma'am.
Yes, am I audible and visible?
You are.
Yes. You
okay.
are.
Professor Khair, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure listening to you. And this has been, as Dr. Nityanandan said, that, it's been such a wonderful 45 minutes that one has learned so much. So, sir, mine is not exactly a question because this, I pretty much agree with everything that you've been saying. About the book of Job, I've had this problem, which I think everyone seems to have. I only read it as literature, not as a religious text. And I tend to think that the God is, such a strange being there who sort of justifies his excesses without bothering to explain himself. And like you very correctly say that, effectively we do not have any resolution by the end of it. We don't know why, what happens. So do you want to talk about it a bit? Why is that how, it was posited? Because that's what makes it religious, is the fact that human beings are not supposed to understand it. Or this is just sort of, a certain piece of writing which we are just supposed to read and let be and say this is the Old Testament and therefore, I mean, what would be your take on it?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think I can only say what I think might be happening, because obviously it's also a text written in a period, a language that, I mean, I cannot claim any scholarship. so I'm only thinking of the text as I have encountered it in English. And I think of it solely as a literary text. I think of all religious literary texts. I think one way would be to go back to the ivory rubber connection, in the sense that whoever the writer is in a similar situation, situation similar to Conrad. There's only that much he or she can say, and perhaps even think. In that period, to suggest that that God's explanation towards the end is not convincing would not be a possibility. Yes. So, and on the other hand, you do need some kind of resolution. So you have this kind of resolution, God comes up with an explanation, and everyone says, oh, fine, no, now job is happy. And that lends itself to what I would call a fundamentalist reading, in the sense that this is what it means, and that's it. It's done, and you cannot have other readings then. But that's probably the period he's writing in, that's probably the kind of person he is. So just as Conrad, just without being conscious of it, cannot talk of rubber, he just leaves it up unconsciously. This person, without being conscious of it, has this resolution. That would be my explanation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. The next question is from a young scholar, Robert Tiggy from Philippines. His question is, first of all, sir, he thanks you for such an enriching activity and such an enriching lecture. His question is, where should we draw the balance between moral and aesthetics in literature?
That's also a difficult question. I don't think there's a real contradiction between moral and aesthetics. I think the contradiction is actually within them. If you think of aesthetics as a set of rules that define what is beautiful, and if you think of morals as a set of rules that define what is right, then you actually belong to the same category, so to say. On the other hand, if you think of morals as again an attempt to live a just life in a changing world using language and reality and all the rest which keeps on changing. And you think of aesthetics as doing something similar, negotiating with, at its simplest, beauty in changing circumstances, then again, that attempt belongs to the other side. So I mean, the older I get, the more I feel that, for instance, I'll try to be a bit clearer by giving you a better example. People talk of atheism and so on and so forth, and I always get stuck there, because not because I'm afraid of saying that, well, one should be an atheist, but because I feel that on both sides there's a kind of simplification. If, for instance, you say that you're an atheist and you believe that you have disproved the existence of God, and so on and so forth, you have come up with a very single reading of evidence, so to say, okay, singular. On the other hand, if you say you are religious, but your God has given you all the answers, what to do, what not to do, what to eat, what not to eat, how to read things and how not to read things, then again, you actually belong to the same category as these atheists who are not willing to discuss, but who are convinced that they've proved the non-existence of God. On the other hand, if you're religious in the sense that your religion allows you to think, to question, then actually you belong to those atheists who are also questioning what might exist or might not exist. So I don't see the division very often as running between these categories. I increasingly feel that the division runs within these categories. If that answers it.
Next question is from Dr. Muhammad Akram. He is an associate professor from Pakistan. His question is, how would you define modern man's dilemma in literature in the present crisis?
That's a very large question, and I think uh, uh, I would only be able to do justice to some aspects of it. I would say that the biggest dilemma that modern man faces is the dilemma of language. Okay? We are a species that depends hugely on language. Unlike other species which communicate and perhaps even at times represent using other ways of other channels, um, we depend heavily on language, and sooner or later we use language to construct an alternative reality. We need language to understand what is out there because that's the way our brains work. But it is very easy to get lost in language. And I think various areas, whether it's nationalism, whether it's religion, whether it's sometimes some aspects of science, some aspects of humanities, all of them run this danger of getting lost in language. And this negotiation, and this is why I think literature is so significant, because literature teaches us to negotiate with this problem. This negotiation is what is central to coming up with some kind of a coherent, sustainable modern existence. Be able to see through language, but not get lost in language. That at its simplest is how I would put it.
Thank you, sir. Just like to convey, sir, that in GNOSIS we have also thought of doing like, we get a lot of questions, so it is not possible to answer the questions in one session. So what we do is we forward the questions to the speaker. They can look at the questions, they can take their own sweet time of 3-4 months and can answer those questions, and we plan to publish it in the forthcoming issues of GNOSIS, which also will serve as an archive for the upcoming researchers and academicians.
That would also suit me, because I'm not very good at thinking on my feet. I'm a slow thinker. So it's nice when I'm given some time to think about issues.
Yes, sir. So the last question, sir, and the rest of the questions I will mail you, sir. The last question is from a budding research scholar. The name is Anam. Anam is a PhD student from FLU, Hyderabad. The question is, how does literature deals with the epistemological and ontological questions differently?
Well, I think epistemological questions can always be resolved at some level or the other. And in that sense, literature would obviously approach them in a slightly different way. Ontological questions are impossible to resolve. And again, in that sense, literature would probably be more open to leaving the matter open. I guess that would be the main difference, the way I would see it.
I'd just like to convey gratitude from one of the budding research scholars from your hometown of Gaya. Her name is Aditi Priya. She says that, sir, I am extremely happy and honored to listen to you. I am doing my research in one of your books, The Thing About Thugs, and it's an absolute honor to listen to you. So Aditi, I hope Aditi is watching. Aditi, I have put across to your role model the question. Thank you, sir. On behalf of entire team GNOSIS, it was an absolute honor and pleasure. And let me put on record to the entire participants out here that Dr. Khair has been one of the humblest persons across the academics that I have come across in the exchange of messages and emails that we have exchanged so far. So it's an absolute honor to have such kind of humble personas in academia, sir. I think the numbers of persons like you with so much of humbleness and humility is very few nowadays. So it's an absolute honor to have people like you in GNOSIS lecture series. You have graced GNOSIS lecture series with such dignified manner and such enriching lecture. Thank you so much, sir, from the core of my heart personally. And on behalf of Team GNOSIS, it was an absolute pleasure to have you, sir. Please keep safe, Stay distant, sir. Namaskar. Namaskar from India. See you soon, sir, in one of the conferences. Hopefully, sir. Thank you so much, sir, to have you. Thank you.
Good. And all best wishes to all of you. And thank you, Dr. Banerjee. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.